5th of August 1945. Thompson. Yes, Professor Thompson, Thomas said, as he sat at his desk. Breakfast had been served, though it was only to Lady Mary, Miss Charlotte and Master George, and now preparations were being made for the party that was being organized for the next day. Master George had been coy when the mention had come of Kitty Gillingham. Miss Sibby had teased him about the girl before, long, dark hair curling without the effort of an iron, deep brown eyes, resembling her father in every way. But Kitty had the sharpness of her mother, Mabel, and had driven ambulances in London with gusto throughout the last year, helping with the victims of the V2s that had come raining down on the capital, much to her mother's horror and her father's approval. And she liked farming, and would manage the estate well. Sibby had told her cousin. George was, however, silent on the matter, but not silent enough to hold a party for the cousins and their friends, a summer soiree, held outside in the grounds. Tomorrow would be a busy day. So it was that day that Thomas knew he had to make inquiries, follow up as many leads as he could in order to find out about some of the things in Milo's letters, and he began with her old laboratory. The Cavendish. A man by the name of Walton answered, and Thomas thought he recognized the name. No, I am sorry, Dr. Walton told Thomas. Professor Thompson died several years ago. Perhaps it is Dr. Thompson you are wanting? And so George Paget Thompson came to the telephone, and spoke briefly to Thomas. And it took 3 hours before the man was standing at the back door of Downton Abbey, having driven immediately from Cambridge to see him. You don't know me, George Paget told Thomas, after Downton's butler excused himself, telling Andy that he would be in the grounds should he be needed, but only if I'm needed, such as a bomb dropping on the house. Andy looked at him, aghast, and he began again. If Master George needs me, tell him I am in the company of a government scientist, and I am in the grounds. Thomas shook his head as they made their way along the path that he and Chadwick had taken the day before. I think I do, Thomas told him. You were at the laboratory when Milo had to speak for a man who had tried to poison Blackett. Before Melusina's graduation, he added. George Paget stopped for a moment, trying to recall. Back in 25? 26? He asked. Yes. And Thomas watched as George Paget Thompson shook his head, a smile on his lips. That man, he said to Thomas, well, I think Blackett forgave him, considering what Oppenheimer has now done. What Oppenheimer has now done? What? But George Paget shook his head. I cannot tell you, he said to Thomas, and lowered his voice, but you will find out shortly, the whole world will. Now, he added, brightly. You talk of dear Ashby? Yes, Thomas told him. Look, I am sorry to hear about your father, and Rutherford. Come to that. All of the people in the laboratory, whoever worked there, Milo was pleased and proud to have worked with. She was at home. He was nearly 90, George Paget told Thomas. He saw so many things, a life well lived. He paused, then added, thoughtfully, and you were married to Ashby? Yes, Thomas told him, and held up the bundle of letters, sent, but never delivered, to Thomas over the course of nearly 20 years. And I take it you've read them all? Or, Chadwick, at least. We have, George Paget admitted. We did. Chadwick and I, we found them in the Cavendish, as we were preparing for war. All efforts were turned over to the war effort. Not that it impressed Roosevelt, he added, with a slight bitterness in his voice. Vannevar Bush got his men to take what we had done, and what they shared back was scant. We are effectively blocked out now, which is why Cockcroft is over on the Cumberland coast. And George Paget broke off. It was a collective effort, the nuclear project, but the Americans were told to hoard information from us. A bad business, he added, shaking his head. I was with an American once. Guy, his name was, Thomas recalled, as they took the left path fork and headed towards the woodland. We lived in California for a time. And then? Asked Thompson. Master George asked me back. Thomas looked back towards Downton Abbey, its central tower rising high above the forest canopy. I should never have left, really, but it took my leaving to see what was really important. He turned back, glancing at George Paget, the image of his father, though minus the handlebar moustache. He died. Did guy too many amphetamines? Actors take them to perk themselves up. His heart failed. Thomas glanced away, earnest. Edward Courtney, guy only Blackett hadn't died on him. I managed to get back to England after, well, a long journey across the states, and then Lord Grantham asked me to come back. Could think of no one better to put the big house. And Thomas had been grateful. And he had written to Milo. That had been in 1932. He had heard about Chadwick's research success from Master George's radio and had telephoned. But Milo was not there, nor had she been for several weeks. When you get this, I will be in Göttingen, Milo had written. In her letter dated February 1932, I could not hold back from seeing H.B., to congratulate him on his Nobel Prize. I was with him, Thomas, when he formulated it. H.B. and I, on the island of Helgoland. He calls it, the uncertainty principle. I told him he should write a letter of thanks to Schrödinger. I meant it as a joke, but Heisenberg did not see the funny side. Schrödinger is as distasteful in his personal life as he is brilliant in his professional life. Besides, he lives in Ireland now, a guest of de Valera, so where to address the letter would be troublesome. To the Free State government in Dublin, I thought, or perhaps, even to Jack Prue, if he is in Cork, with the Jameson distillery. I joke, and now am I serious, Thomas. I needed to see him, I hope you understand. And yourself? Thomas asked, struggling with his thoughts to return to Downton's woodlands. You are still at the Cavendish. Much of what we did is now distributed to other laboratories, George Paget told Thomas. It went to P.I. Earls and Friss in Birmingham, under the guise of tube alloys, and, of course, Linman at Oxford wanted it all. Not that he knows the first place to start, he added, with a cattiness that could rival Thomas in his younger days. New research is being carried out. Biological research. Not so surprising, if one considers the effect of nuclear radiation on the body. Two young whippersnappers, Crick and Watson, both work where Ashby and Blackett once worked. He sighed. Such is life, how things move on. And then he turned to Thomas. I confide that I have your trust that anything I say will not be repeated. Of course, Thomas told him, such as anything I ask or confide to you is likewise. Undoubtedly, George Paget reassured him. So, please tell me, what do you know of Milo being in Germany, especially around the dates of 1932 and 1933? 88,888,888. To say that George Paget Thompson looked uncomfortable was an understatement. The man looked away at the question, and it took Thomas to stop by the gamekeeper's cottage and turn to look at him for him to look back. You have to understand, me Lucina was always faithful to you, he told Thomas. No man, myself included I admit, could tempt her to even step out to a cafe. But with Heisenberg, it was different. He and Ashby were ... as if they were one person. Ashby saw no German in him, only a brilliant mind, and someone who listened to her, and who she liked to listen to in return. There was innocence in all of that. And so, when she went back to Göttingen in 1932, no one thought much of it. She always came back with something for us, something for Cockcroft. He was working on a particle accelerator at the time, something for me in my work with isotopes. Chadwick, of course, had been lauded for the neutron. But Milo had done a lot of the work. Thomas began to walk again. Overhead a blackbird soared through the tree canopy, singing his bright song. And she was resentful? Thomas asked him as they plunged on, deeper into the wood. Because he was credited and she was not? George Paget stopped walking. You of all people should know that Ashby was not like that. But she had decided to end her work at the Cavendish. Her plan was to go to work with the Marconi Company, in London. She had relatives there, she told us. Yes, Thomas told him, glancing about him. Guglielmo was her cousin. But she never came back. Marconi had returned to Italy, so I am given to understand. Did she visit him? But Thomas shook his head. You know that isn't the reason, Dr. Thompson, he told him, beginning to put one foot in front of him, and then another. I know the reason, said good morning to me not 4 hours ago, and told me he had news. The reason crossed the North Sea, fleeing the only home he had ever known in search of his mother. George Paget Thompson looked at Thomas in amazement, raising his palm to his head. The child, he managed, shaking his head. And he did not go to his father? He glanced away. No. Well, considering where Heisenberg is now, he added, quieter. And yet I saw her, 6, 7 years afterwards, and she didn't tell me. George Paget's last sentence not passing Thomas by at all. Not one hint. She told me everything, once, but not about her son, whom she gave up for adoption. Mr. Barrow, Ashby was in love with Heisenberg, George Paget told him. Absolutely, completely. Yet, with every thought, she was compounded by guilt because of you. I know this, because she told me. It was why she went along with Professor Lindman's scheme. Lindman? Chadwick had mentioned the name the day before. I told her, begged her, not to do it, George Paget went on, but she went anyway. The bastard knew exactly what to say to her. He shook his head, angry at the memory. It had been at the Cavendish, not 3 weeks after Rutherford had died. His contempt for Milo, for all of Rutherford's boys, was palpable, yet she still went. And she spent her years beside Heisenberg working on ... whatever he was working on. A nuclear bomb. Thomas told him, striding steadily up the path that led to the back of the Folly. George Paget looked at him in amazement, and also with some alarm. How could you possibly? I guessed. Thomas told him. She had always worried about one being made. We believe the Nazi regime was trying to make an atomic bomb. Yes. But their efforts turned out to be minuscule. As if someone was trying deliberately to make it fail. Thomas asked, wryly, pulling up as he watched George Paget pull something from his overcoat. He took a few steps towards him, holding the paper out towards Thomas. Look at this, he told Thomas. And Thomas looked. On the paper it looked to him like an oblong, with 5 lines crossing the top line of the shape vertically, sticking out from the top. Speckled light passing through the tree canopy scattered on the page. Thomas looked further, down, at the words, but the words seemed unreadable across the top. He turned it over, and on the back was a pattern of lines, drawn up one side of the page and continuing across the top. He turned it back over again. Are you familiar with a man named Carl Friedrich van Weizsäcker? George Paget asked Thomas. Had Chadwick asked him the day before, Thomas would have said that he wasn't. But he had read Milo's letters and the name had been in them. Milo had been trying to tell Thomas of the man, though what, in her cryptic style, he did not know. Perhaps he would know now. Von Weizsäcker was the deputy on a project that the Nazis had put together, to work on extracting the energy from uranium. We know this because the Americans, crossing from France, found something that looked very much like this in a cave underneath a cathedral in a Bavarian town called Hagelosh. We believe that the Uranium Club, as they were called, were trying to build it, a nuclear reactor, to produce energy of some kind. Milo got on with von Weizsäcker, by all accounts. By whose accounts? Thomas asked, sharply. Something was more than he was being told. He could sense it. But George Paget waved the question away. Heisenberg and von Weizsäcker made a journey, to Denmark, to meet with Niels Bohr at the start of the war, he went on. Heisenberg left Bohr with a deep impression that Germany was about to win the war, and that they had been working on this. He gestured towards the paper still in Thomas's hand. Knowing what was discovered, it looked very much like this drawing. An energy-making device? Not a bomb? Not a bomb, George Paget told him. But whatever Heisenberg said to Bohr, the man certainly thought so. He fled to Sweden, but only after dissolving the Nobel Prizes of 2 Jewish scientists, so the Nazis could not find them and know they were in Copenhagen. Helped get Elise Meitner out to Sweden too. Elise Meitner, Thomas repeated the name, still looking at the picture. She was whom Milo was so keen to meet, another woman in science, besides Madame Curie. George Paget smiled. And she did. The women got on very well. Friss was with Meitner too. He is her cousin. And then the RAF got both Friss and Bohr out. Boer had to be strapped into the bomb housing of a Lancaster to get across the channel. He made it to America in the end. In the bomb housing of a Lancaster? Thomas asked, astounded. George Pegott smiled. No, he replied, then gestured to the drawing again. He took this with him, took it all the way to America. Showed the people working on there. Well, our bomb, Chadwick, who was out there at the time, Friss too. And I was there the night Friss gave us all a concert. He is a frightfully good piano player. Before breaking off and rushing off, none of us knew what that was about, until he returned and knocked skulls with Chadwick, and George Pegott took the letter gently from Thomas's unresisting hand. Here, he showed him. A pattern of idle marks, Thomas said, dismissively. Or, the use of the old Irish system of letters known Ogham, George Pegott told him. Thomas felt his mouth fall open. Ashby had taught Friss, as a way to stop Oppenheimer from knowing what they were doing, when Oppie was at the Cavendish. But dear Otto had never forgotten, and he translated it for Chadwick. There was no bomb in Germany, and there never would be. The men working on it, with Ashby, who had been sent by Lindman to scupper as much of the uranium project as she could, colluded with von Weizsäcker to have Heisenberg draw something out for Boer and insist he keep it. Heisenberg, no Nazi, was yet a patriot. He married shortly before the war, has a Ewing family. He would never have passed that over such a cowardly message willingly to Boer. But Ashby had colluded with von Weizsäcker to get the message across to the Allies. Thomas glanced at the paper again and thought of Milo. She had been in Britain at the start of the war. Had Heisenberg married when she left, or did she leave because of it? He thought of the words Milo had committed to paper for Thomas, of how Germany had become the dictatorship that it did. When I heard that Hansberg had been persecuted, turned out of his home, his laboratory torn to pieces by thugs, I cried, Thomas, I really did. A kinder and more sweet man I could never show you, apart from Planck. Of course, Heisenberg had just been giving a lecture about the neutron. He wished me to speak. But before I could, out of the seated students several got to their feet, all wearing the Nazi symbol, all denouncing Jewish science, particle physics, which has been branded thus, and therefore is raged against. I was shaken, but said it was their loss not to hear what I had to say. And, within 2 hours he was turned upon, perhaps even by those who had been sitting in the audience in Heisenberg's hall. His house had been set on fire and books and papers that pertained to particle physics had been taken into the quad of buildings. Petrol had been poured on them and they were aflame. Leaves rustled in front of them, and Thomas was brought back to the present. He began to walk again. This route would take them to the back of Downton Abbey, and to Thompson's car. He was here to tell him of Milo. Thomas couldn't imagine he would want to stay longer than that. Yet there was something weighty between them, not just me. Lucina Ashby. Thompson gave Thomas the impression that he wished to linger, to waste time, to distract himself from something. So this is how you know there was no bomb, Thomas told him. Milo gave her life for this. He stopped, grief overcoming him, and wandered away from Thompson, hand to his head. It was no love affair, then. She had not gone back to Germany just to be with Heisenberg, and got sucked into his work. It had been planned by some sort of secret agency in Britain, and Milo had been just the right person at just the right time. He felt a lump in his throat. He sank down onto the dry summer grass, the view of Downton laughing in the high sunlight. We at Los Alamos, George Pegott told Thomas, sitting down next to him. We decided to keep this information from Vannevar Bush, from Roosevelt, Truman now, of course, though his policy is to keep all of Roosevelt's policies. Had the president known, he might have stopped the budget, stopped the project. It was in everyone's interests that a bomb of our own was indeed developed. And, ironically, beside it, atomic reactors that could produce energy, that could be used to make electricity. But Thomas's thoughts were back with Milo, with the words she had written, about Planck and Ley and Bohr and Einstein, helping Jewish scientists flee Germany, making for Britain, making for America. He was no Nazi, George Pegott was at pains to reiterate. And you ask about 1932, Milo went to join Heisenberg, not in Göttingen, but in Leipzig, the youngest professor of physics ever appointed anywhere. He hesitated. "Mr. Barrow, if I may speak frankly," he told him. "More frankly than the letters from my wife that were never delivered?" Thomas asked, bitterly. "Yes," George Paget told him. Ashby was in Germany in a dangerous year. Already Heisenberg was being noticed for his lectures on Einstein's theory of relativity, and not in a good way. Whether or not he knew that Ashby was, well, pregnant, I cannot say, but he did give her money to leave Germany. She made it to Hamburg, and then to Bremerhaven, on the coast. He made her leave. But she hadn't gone, Thomas thought. She was pregnant with Ernst then. And he thought about his wife's words, in her letter that he had read the night before: "I have done a terrible thing, Thomas ... or, at least, you will think that I have, for I am ashamed of myself." HB does not know, and will never know. It was one night, and only once. Our family, our physics family, is fragmented. They have fled. We were disturbed. We listened to Beethoven when we heard Planck's son had been arrested. I have never seen Werner look so bleak. There were many scientists who took against the purge. Lay one of them, George Paget told Thomas. Always both hands full, so he did not have to give the Nazi salute. Planck was the most pitiful. He lost his son to execution for a plot that did not even involve him. Poor man, having lost his wife and twin daughters. George Paget looked away, his eyes resting on Downton Abbey. But Ashby seemed to be full of optimism, at least, until she returned after Rutherford's death. She said she would never see Germany again. But then, Lindman came and made her an offer. Thomas turned his head to George Paget. Something didn't scan. Something ... he could not determine. Milo left in 32, but did not leave. Instead, she stayed somewhere in the north of Germany, and gave birth to Ernst, and gave him up for adoption. Saw him settled before she even tried to come back. But she was back in Germany again after Rutherford had died, had gone back to Heisenberg, having left the Marconi Company. And it had been in 37 that Heisenberg had been arrested by the SS, interrogated by Himmler. Milo had committed that to paper too, how the man had been taken, and kept waiting, because of his pursuit of what the regime had called Jewish science. He had been agitated, as he was kept waiting for hours and hours, being accused of treachery to his country and being a homosexual. She knew about Heisenberg's arrest, and then came back here, Thomas told George Paget, getting back to his feet, and Paget nodded. "I am sure." "No, I know, Milo was in Downton in 1937, it was one of the last times I saw her." He shook his head. She had been distracted, ill at ease. Having read her letter about this, Thomas could understand why ... especially if she thought he had received everything she had sent him in the past 5 years. And then Heisenberg married, almost suddenly. They descended the slope of the folly, on the path that took them either towards the generator building or forked on a longer path towards Downton Village. If he was accused of being a homosexual, George Paget told Thomas, it is ... a dreadful situation for a man to be in. Thomas gave him a long look. Did he know? He surely must have guessed. And he was right. The newsreels at the cinema showed rank upon rank of dead and dying, in concentration camps, imprisoned not just for their religion or their race, but their religious belief, or their sexuality. Thomas imagined a knock on a door, or police not shy of being heavy-handed, shouting, arresting, pushing, imprisoning. He shuddered. So ... she chose to go back, to Germany, to work with him, Thomas concluded, as they continued down the hillock. She was persuaded by this ... Lindman. It was under the guise of special operations, which I know I should not be talking to you about, Mr. Barrow, George Paget added. Then why are you? In fact, why are you here at all? Dr. Thompson. Why did you drive immediately 3 hours up the Great North Road to tell me all of this? To have a walk in some fine woodland? Paget looked at Thomas. Because I thought you ought to know the facts, about your wife, Ashby. What she did when she was in Germany, what she and von Weizsäcker planned to do. How she got the message out to the Allies. But Thomas was shaking his head, a smile on his face. That would be Milo. He told him, yes. she would have done all of those things. But there is something else, isn't there? Dr. Thompson, more than Chadwick told me yesterday. More than Chadwick had stumbled over. A cough had developed during his conversation with Thomas the day before. He's permanently ill, or getting over an illness, or developing an illness, Milo had once told him. Chadwick had suffered in the Great War, being interned in Berlin, visiting the same scientist, Geiger, who had handed over his colleagues to the Nazis 20 years later. And yet Chadwick had not been idle. Even in prison he had replicated an experiment of Rutherford using aluminium foil and toothpaste containing radium. I do need this back, Paget told Thomas, holding out his hand for the letter on which the uranium energy machine bomb design had been drawn, which, on the reverse, contained the ogham Milo knew Frisk could interpret. Why, it is Milo's, is it not? And she was my wife. He hung on to the letter tantalizingly between himself and George Paget Thompson. Thompson did not grab for them, but instead gave a brief nod. That word gave Frisk a laugh, George Paget told Thomas. He pointed to a line of stripes that was running down the left-hand side of the page. Just that bar alone. She guessed Frisk would show this to Oppenheimer, and interpret the words for him. And what does it say? Apple, George Paget told him. There was a moment, then, just a short moment in the grave atmosphere between the two men, that they both laughed. And when they stopped, Thomas gave Dr. Thompson the document back. Then Chadwick did not tell you, he concluded to Thomas, and shook his head, sadly. And Thomas shook his own head. That this artifact, along WTH the letters Chadwick brought to you yesterday, were retrieved from the cold, dead body of Jack Prue. How it got from the American desert from Boa's possession into the hands of that spy and traitor no one knows. Prue. Thomas breathed. He had the name in his mind, ever since Chadwick had brought up his name. But James Chadwick had told him nothing. Can you understand why an Irish Republican might be of interest to Nazi Germany? George Paget asked him. I can guess, Thomas told him. It can be for no good. It was for ... some good. One good thing, George Paget conceded, breaking off as several children hurried by, at the bottom of the grass of Downton, across the path. The Parker twins, Thomas recognized, and several other children from their school. They stopped when they saw Thompson's car, excited by the vehicle, for it was indeed very modern. Would you like to meet Ernst? Thomas asked suddenly. I think he would like to meet anyone who knew his mother. And George Paget looked as if he was really considering it for a moment. Under the circumstances of today, tomorrow, I think not, he told Thomas. Once this is over, then yes. Certainly yes. And what circumstances are those? Thomas asked. Political, he told Thomas. But the whole world will know ... soon. But Thomas was not content with mystery. He stopped walking and turned to Thompson. What circumstances? He insisted. What circumstances would bring yourself, and Chadwick, all the way up to Yorkshire to speak to the butler of a big house about, and here Thomas broke off, ARP training kicking in, political circumstances, of secrets that I know you shall not have shared. Dr. Thompson, he added, his voice low in volume, but no less urgent. And then Dr. George Paget Thompson turned to Thomas, pushing him back at the shoulder, so he stood in front of him. He gripped Thomas's shoulder, and looked at him with a ferocity that Thomas could not have imagined given his genial, confiding tones of the last hour. Me Lucino Ashby, Mr. Barrow. He hissed at him. Then, as suddenly as he had seized Thomas, he let him go again, a hand going to his head. Ashby, he reiterated. Thomas shook his head. He didn't know, did he? Perhaps you haven't heard, Dr. Thompson, Thomas replied, slowly, deliberately, that me Lucina was taken by the Nazis. A program called Night and Fog. She died in 1943. I am, Thomas concluded, more surprised than he expected at what he was about to say. I am ... bereft without her, he told the world. I loved her, so very much, in my own way, a concentration camp, for political prisoners. Terrible things done to her before she was either hanged or burned to death. Thomas felt tears behind his eyes and wished Chadwick was gone, so he could let go of his emotions, so he could cry and mourn the passing of the woman whom he had married to protect, an intention at which Thomas had failed most spectacularly at. "Milo is dead," was all Thomas could manage. And he watched as Dr. George Paget Thompson inhaled deeply, and put his hands to his hips for a moment. "Mr. Barrow," Thompson concluded, "Milo Senior is not dead." Special Operations, Professor Lindman, took the decision to tell everyone she was dead. It took a moment for this to sink in. At first, Thomas thought he had misheard, and he stared at Thompson. "It is true she was heading to a political prisoner camp," he told Thomas. "It is true she suffered ... horrific injuries." But suddenly, they stopped. Suddenly, the guard changed and the door swung open. He pointed to the ogum on the document still in Thomas's hand. "Jack Prue," Thomas breathed. And it all made sense to him. It was generally rumored that Irish Republicans were aiding the Nazis in return for help with the cause. De Valera himself even issued a statement on behalf of THR Free State expressing sympathy when Hitler took his own life. The statement was reported on the newsreels, so it was clear where the line was drawn. He made it stop. He convinced Albert Speer that someone must have made a mistake. Why would a valuable physicist, expert in uranium, be caught up in a prison camp, when Speer's top priority was to acquire the bomb for Hitler? Thompson shook his head. So, what happened? For him, intrigue and mystery were the game, not outright, bald questions, but now, here, he could not help himself. She returned to Hagelosh, to work on the uranium project, help build what the Americans discovered and believe was a nuclear reactor. With the scientists there, under von Weizsäcker's lead, did her best to confound and scupper the advances of the bomb, tell Speer that it was an impossible task in the time frame that was expected. The face of the uranium project became an energy reactor instead, and Hitler directed his interest into rocket technology. They have pretty well admitted a sabotage of the whole project. In any case, the V1 and V2, Thomas breathed. His mind raced. So, she had not died under torture. She had not been executed 2 years before. Jack Prue had saved Milo once more.